Harvard University has a knack of hiring very bright minds who are also phenomenal naturalists. And I think that the next speaker exemplifies that. And all I would say is get his recent book, and you'll see where you combine really great ideas with the sensitivities of a really good naturalist. Our next speaker, Jonathan Losos, he has the longest title, the Monique and Philip Lerner Professor for the Study of Latin America and Curator of Herpetology. And Jonathan has made many, many fundamental contributions to the study of adaptive radiation, ecomorphology, community structure, and on and on and on. So very pleased to, his title here says the causes and consequences of evolutionary radiation, and I think the title on the talk is a little bit different. But come and please edify us on adaptive radiation.
Thank you very much, Joel, for that very kind introduction. Might be getting a phone call. There we go. My topic today is adaptive radiation, those groups that are extraordinarily diverse in their ecology and their morphology, often very species-rich. Adaptive radiations have been of interest to evolutionary biologists throughout the history of the field. I want to draw particular attention to George Gaylord Simpson, who really advanced our thinking on the topic in his work in the mid-1950s. Despite this interest, I think things have really taken off to a great extent, this interest in adaptive radiation, in the last 15 to 20 years. And I think this renewed interest is attributable to two causes. First is a detailed understanding of the mechanisms, of the evolutionary mechanisms underlying adaptive radiation, an understanding of how natural selection drives adaptation and how speciation produces the fundamental units that are involved in adaptive radiations. Now, Dolph Schluter's book 9 years ago, I think, is a wonderful exposition of what we know about adaptive radiation and clearly laid out, I think, a very firm understanding of how it works. And I'll be talking more about Dolph's book later. The second reason for renewed interest in adaptive radiation has to do with the rise of molecular phylogenetics, and in particular, findings made in a number of cases where groups were realized to be radiations that they had not previously been recognized. For example, this clade of Malagasy birds was initially thought to be the result of multiple colonizations to Madagascar from birds of different families. However, the molecular phylogeny indicated that, in fact, it was an in situ radiation producing a wide variety of ecologically and morphologically distinctive forms. Now, this may, in fact, harken back to Darwin. As we all know the story, in the Galapagos, Darwin did not recognize the birds that now bear his name, the Darwin's finches, as a natural group. He thought that they were the result of they were related to many different families on the mainland. And it was only when he went back to England and the ornithologist John Gould told him that they were one group that he realized their evolutionary significance. And this sort of finding has occurred repeatedly in group after group in molecular phylogenetics when we've discovered that taxa form evolutionary clades. For example, the East African Rift Lake cichlids in many cases were thought to be the results of multiple colonizations, but the molecular phylogeny indicates that they are the result of very few, perhaps only one ancestral form. For example, the huge number of species in Lake Victoria may be the result of a single colonizing species. So this finding in molecular phylogenetics has really renewed interest in the causes underlying these adaptive radiations. In addition, there's been a second area in which molecular phylogenetics has spurred interest in radiations, and this has been the finding that Mark McPeak spoke about yesterday. Very commonly, when we look at a phylogeny for a group, we see a burst of evolutionary diversification early in a tree. This has been interpreted as a signature of adaptive radiation, of groups diversifying quickly to fill empty ecological space. And repeatedly, in recent years, we've seen papers noting this pattern and interpreting it in the light of adaptive radiation. Well, in my talk today, my goal is to review what we know about adaptive radiation, and in the light of Dolph Schluter's book and other work, ask what remains to be learned, what don't we know? I'll start by defining adaptive radiation. Now, there are many definitions in the literature, but I think Doug Fatuma's definition from his 1998 textbook really captures the essence of what most people think about. And adaptive radiation is evolutionary divergence of members of a single phylogenetic lineage into a variety of different adaptive forms. So the idea that one ancestral species produces descendants that are very ecologically diverse. Now, in this talk today, I'm going to try where possible to be maybe a little bit provocative or controversial, or leave topics that we can talk about later. One of them has to do with definitions of adaptive radiation. You'll notice that I say that this definition doesn't include anything about the rate at which radiation occurs. Many people include rate as part of a definition of an adaptive radiation, that it must occur very quickly. I agree with this definition of Doug's that that is not part of what we should consider the definition. It's more a hypothesis to be tested. I just throw that out as something that people might want to pick up later. Now, a second aspect of this definition is it doesn't include anything about species richness. When we think about evolutionary radiation, there are actually two axes of importance. The first is the ecological variety of forms produced in the radiation, what has been termed disparity. And adaptive radiation refers to those groups that are exceptionally disparate in terms of their ecological variety. Now, in fact, many adaptive radiations are quite species rich. Think cichlids, or at a broader scale, beetles or angiosperms, or so on. But not all adaptive radiations have many species. Some of them, in fact, have relatively few. Probably the most famous case are the Darwin's finches, exceptionally disparate in terms of ecology and morphology, but only 14 species. Another example near and dear to my heart is a type of lizard, the Cordyliformes from southern Africa, a very ancient clade with relatively few species, but yet with a great variety of morphological forms occupying a wide variety of different environments. Now, on the other hand, some clades show the opposite pattern. They are extremely species rich, but have very little ecological diversity. How do I do this? Oh, yeah, there we go, down here. Examples include, for example, the Plethodon salamanders of the eastern United States. Remarkable number of species. Maybe some people will disagree, but there's really not much ecological differentiation. They're very homogeneous, but yet they're very species rich. Another example we heard about yesterday from Mark McPeak, the damselflies he studies in the genus Analagma. So you can't have species richness without ecological and morphological diversification. I'll come back to this topic, how it relates to adaptive radiation, later in the talk. Now, we might ask, though, how does non-adaptive speciation occur? And Mark talked about this yesterday. There are a number of explanations. In some cases, groups simply tend to get geographically isolated fairly easily, and as a result can speciate allopatrically without producing much ecological divergence. This sort of research has been centered recently here at Stony Brook with John Weens and colleagues, who've argued that groups that tend not to evolve, that have a lot of what is termed niche conservatism, can end up being fragmented as the climate changes, so they become geographically isolated as intervening areas become unsuitable. They then turn into different species, but they're ecologically not very differentiated. Such groups that are predisposed to such phenomena may end up having a lot of species without much ecological diversity. Another phenomenon mentioned by Mark yesterday is sexual selection. Groups that for some reason are particularly liable to experience divergent sexual selection may end up becoming reproductively isolated, but even though the reproductive and mating systems have evolved ecologically, they may remain very much the same. Now, of course, I'm not trying to claim that hummingbirds aren't ecologically diverse. This is just a pretty picture. But groups particularly liable to have sexual selection may end up with many species and little ecological diversity. Another example of a non-adaptive radiation. Well, how does adaptive radiation work? I want to give you a cartoon version of what I consider to be the classic model, what I think is very consistent with what Simpson said more than 50 years ago, consistent too with Dolph Schluter's writing a few years ago. It goes something like this. You start out with an ancestral species that somehow finds itself in a place with many resources of different types that aren't being utilized. Now, then speciation occurs. I'm not going to talk for the moment how it occurs. Just bear with me. You get a bunch of species more or less ecologically very similar. These species then eat up all the resources. They become limiting, and so competition for resources begins to become an issue. As a result, the species partition the resources. They start the species start differing in which resources they use to minimize the ecological interactions. And then, through the magic of natural selection, and watch carefully here, I'm very proud of this, they adapt to their different resources. And voila, an adaptive radiation. This, I think, as I said, is consistent with what many people think of how adaptive radiation works. And in fact, we have a large body of data that supports this idea. There are three basic points underlying this idea. The first is that there is an availability of multiple resource types that can be utilized, what is commonly now being called ecological opportunity. Secondly, interspecific competition is the process that drives different species to use different parts of this resource spectrum. And then natural selection leads to adaptation, each species adapting to the resources it uses. Now, there are many well-developed case studies, certainly the Darwin's finches, the work of the Grants and others, that clearly show all these postulates to be correct. Anolis lizards, I would suggest, also strongly support these ideas. And in fact, Dolph's book was a beautiful exposition of all of the evidence supporting each one of these ideas. And I would argue that this model of adaptive radiation is now very firmly established as correct in many cases. This is more or less how adaptive radiation works much of the time. So the question that I would like to spend the rest of the talk discussing is what's left to be learned. And in particular, I want to focus on three questions. First, is ecological opportunity necessary for adaptive radiation? Second, what processes other than interspecific competition might be important? And third, how does speciation fit into adaptive radiation? What is its role? So we'll start with the concept of ecological opportunity. Now, in recent years, the literature is full of people invoking this idea of ecological opportunity as being a very important determinant of the extent of adaptive radiation. There's lots of quotes, particularly, as I said, coming out of papers on molecular phylogenies of different groups. We might ask, actually, what is ecological opportunity? In some sense, it's an obvious idea, but how do we define it? Well, it was implicit in what Simpson was talking about 50 years ago when he said that an adaptive radiation resulted when a group entered an adaptive zone that was either occupied by organisms that were competitively inferior or was completely empty. Schluter had a similar definition. He said that ecological opportunity is loosely defined as a wealth of evolutionarily accessible resources little used by competing taxa. And yet another definition this year from Rundle and Price, more or less the same idea. Now, if you read this definition and you think about it, it's actually kind of fuzzy. And there's a lot of wiggle room here, and I think we might come back to this later on in discussion. Some of you may see shades of the idea of the empty niche, which of course is an idea that is highly controversial. So this definition is problematic when you think about it in detail, but I think the general idea is pretty clear. A group gets to a place where there's lots of resources and no other taxon is doing a good job of utilizing them. Well, where does this idea come from, that ecological opportunity spurs adaptive radiation? It comes from a number of observations. First, the idea that the observation of colonization of empty environments, the idea that a new island pops up into the sea, out of the sea, and that species slowly disperse there and create a new ecosystem, and the first species that get there have a wide open ecological milieu. They're freed of all the species that they had to deal with in continental settings. And in fact, many, perhaps most of our most famous cases of adaptive radiation come from islands. The Hawaiian honeycreepers and the Darwin's finches, for example, both groups in which the birds have proliferated to occupy a very wide range of ecological niches, much wider than these groups, than their ancestors on the mainland occupied. And in fact, both the honeycreepers and the finches occupy ecological types, niches if you will, that are used by many different families in continental settings. So the idea is they get to this island, these niches these ways of life are not being utilized, and they diversify and fill these ecological spaces. I realize my terminology is going to get me in trouble with some of you here. Many other examples of this, for example, the Hawaiian silver swords in Hawaii and many other cases on islands. Clearly the idea of you have this empty ecological landscape, ecological opportunity, spurring adaptive radiation. Now the same idea can result from extinction, where you have something happen that wipes out many of the species, leaving those few survivors, such as our ancestors, to then radiate in the absence of what was previously there. And in fact, the fossil record is has many examples after mass extinctions of very high rates of species proliferation and ecological diversification. Here's one example from brachiopods showing that the rate of morphological evolution was very high right after the Permo-Triassic extinction, as these forms became very differentiated, evolving very rapidly. Many examples from the paleontological literature supporting that the aftermath of mass extinction, the ecological opportunity, led to adaptive radiation. A third idea is that not that species colonize new areas, but simply that the new environment appears where they live and they take advantage of it. For example, the origin of grasses in the Miocene and the spread of grasslands is thought to have provoked the adaptive radiation of horses, taking advantage of this new opportunity. Another case comes from plants in the genus Espeletia in the northern Andes. This is a high-altitude group found in the Paramo, very diverse in morphology and ecology. Now, as you know, the Andes are a young mountain chain, only a relatively few million years old. Presumably what happened is that Espeletia rode the mountains up, and as these new high-altitude environments formed, they took advantage of the opportunity and diversified widely. Finally, the last example, and with apologies to Joel here, key innovations. Now, by a key innovation, I mean the classic definition, the idea that an evolution of a feature that allows a group to interact with the environment in a new way. A key innovation does not necessarily cause adaptive radiation, nor cause species proliferation. It simply allows a group to interact with the environment in a new way. Now, sometimes these new ways allow it to access resources that were previously unavailable. We could imagine, for example, that the evolution of flight in bats provided access to all kinds of aerial insects and other prey that weren't previously available and allowed them to diversify to utilize these resources. So in this way, a key innovation can allow access to ecological opportunity and prompt adaptive radiation. Well, these four ideas are supported in many, to a greater or lesser extent with many examples, and so this is where the idea that ecological opportunity plays an important role in triggering adaptive radiation. What I'd like to ask now is ecological opportunity necessary for adaptive radiation? And in some sense, you might think, well, of course it is. How could it not be? I think the major alternative is that, in fact, groups are able to radiate in the absence of initial ecological opportunity, that basically there's some other group that already utilizes those resources, and this new group comes in and basically supplants them and takes over these resources and radiates. Now, the paleontological literature is replete with examples of people suggesting that one group has radiated and outcompeted another group. For example, it was suggested that birds were responsible for the demise of pterosaurs because they did a better job of utilizing aerial resources. However, the signature of that in the paleontological record, there's been a variety of discussion of what it might look like, and it ought to look something like this. Sorry about that. That the first group becomes very common and dominant, and then the second group comes in and basically replaces them, and the first group grows away. And I now think it's safe to say that there is a consensus in the paleontological literature, maybe I'll be corrected about this later, that there is very little evidence that this occurs. With a few exceptions, there are very few examples in which one group seems to have come in and outcompeted another group and replaced it. The fossil evidence just does not suggest this pattern occurring. And so this idea that one group can supplant another by outcompeting it is not supported by the fossil record. This conclusion is actually bolstered by what is happening with invasive species today. As we know, invasive species are a real scourge, causing real problems in modern ecosystems, causing many species to go extinct. However, there are very few examples of an invading species outcompeting a native species and causing that species to go extinct. Very few examples. What is causing extinction as a result of invasive species is the result of predation or the introduction of new diseases or new parasites. But in very few cases is competition the cause for a native species going extinct. So I think that this congruence between what we see in ecological time of no competition leading to extinction by new species and what the paleontological record suggests strongly indicates that, makes it seem very unlikely that an ancestral species could come into an area and actually radiate in the presence of another group and force it into extinction. So from from these lines of evidence, I have to conclude that ecological opportunity does seem to be a necessary prerequisite for adaptive radiation. A group must find itself in an area where there are these available resources that can be utilized. There are, however, other ways. This discussion assumes that the ecological opportunity pre-exists the presence of a group that takes advantage of it. It's something sitting there and that the group comes in and fills the opportunity, if you will. Another possibility, however, is that radiating clades create their own opportunity, that in some sense radiations can become self-propagating. Now, how might this happen? I should point out that the work in molecular phylogenetics and much of our thinking about ecological opportunity is along the lines that the more species there are, as species diversity increases, opportunity decreases. The niches get filled, ecological opportunity goes away. Community ecologists, at least some of them, however, think about ecological opportunity in another way. And their argument is that the more species there are in a community, the more opportunity there is, because there are more species that can be exploited by others. And certainly the more down here, the more prey you have, the more predators or parasites can take advantage of them. This suggests the possibility that radiations actually, as they become more diverse, may create their own opportunities by creating more species that other members of the radiation might utilize. Now, of course, implicit in this is that there's more than competition going on in a radiation. And when they start having multiple trophic levels, then you can have predation and other interactions going on between clade members. Well, there are, of course, natural history examples of this. For example, cichlids, we know a number of cases. This is one of the famous scale raspers. This is a mimic of this species. It sneaks up on this guy and then takes a little bite out of it and eats a few of its scales. And of course, you're probably familiar with the eye plucker cichlids that do the same thing, more or less. And so there are a number of cichlids that prey on other types of cichlids. And so in this case, the radiation of cichlids has created more opportunity, perhaps spurring more evolutionary diversification. In my own group, the Anolis lizards, we see the same thing, where bigger species will eat littler species. So certainly the possibility exists that radiations may create their own ecological opportunity. Now, this was an idea that Dolph put out in his book 10 years ago. It really hasn't been followed up empirically in any way, although there is now a theoretical literature developing on the idea of how food webs may evolve in this sort of way. There is, however, some example of this from did I lose a slide here? No, I'm sorry. The second possibility is the idea of ecosystem engineering. The idea that one species can change the ecosystem and create new ecological opportunities for other species. For example, the famous example of beavers. They build these beaver ponds. It changes the environment. It creates ecological space that other species then utilize in ways that weren't previously possible. Or species that dig up the substrate, either on land or in the sea, create new environments that other species could utilize. We could imagine that a radiation might do this as well. As species radiate, they change the ecosystem and then allow the radiation to move in new ways. There are actually no examples of this in the empirical natural world, but there are some examples from microbial studies of adaptive radiation. I'm going to talk about these studies more in a minute. But in this case, what happens is you have one species in a flask that, when fed a certain resource, as a waste product, it excretes something else. It then gives rise to a second microbial species in the flask, descended from the first, that uses the waste product as food. And so in this case, the first species has created a new resource, allowing radiation of a second species to utilize that resource. So certainly in theory, this could happen. But as I said, there's very little evidence of it. So in conclusion, ecological opportunity seems necessary for adaptive radiation. Clades could be self-propagating and creating their own opportunity, although there's very little evidence of this to date, perhaps because people haven't looked that hard so far. I want to digress for just one moment to ask, why does adaptive radiation not occur sometimes in the presence of ecological opportunity? And of course, the famous example that Darwin himself looked at, the mockingbirds of the Galapagos. They are not very disparate. They haven't diversified to much extent in the Galapagos. In fact, other than the finches, none of the land birds have radiated. Why not? Well, there's four possible explanations. One is, in fact, that we're mistaken. There is no opportunity. The second is that there's no ability to utilize the resources. Maybe mockingbirds can't take advantage of what's available in the Galapagos. Certainly the ancestors of bats had no ability to take advantage of whatever aerial insects were available. A third possibility I'll get back to later, maybe speciation for some reason can't occur. Speciation is necessary for adaptive radiation. If you don't have multiple species, you can't have a radiation. And if a group can't speciate for some reason, then it can't take advantage and diversify. And the last example, something we talked about a lot yesterday, maybe for some reason a group simply is not evolvable. They can't diversify in the presence of this opportunity. Well, I want to digress from this digression to focus on this first idea about lack of opportunity. And the question I'd like to ask is in the absence of radiation, can we determine whether ecological opportunity actually exists? And more particularly, is this actually a usable concept, or is it just a nice idea that after the fact makes a good post hoc explanation? And what I would suggest is that, in fact, it's very difficult a priori to identify ecological opportunity. It certainly hasn't been done in the literature. We can't look at the mockingbirds and actually say whether there was an opportunity that they have failed to utilize. And so I just throw that out as a discussion point, maybe, whether ecological opportunity is an operationally useful term in understanding when adaptive radiation might occur. Okay, in my last few minutes, I'm going to quickly talk about two other topics. First, are there other processes besides interspecific competition that could drive adaptive radiation? And perhaps the most likely is predation. Consider again my cartoon. Consider we have these 4 species that occur in the same place, but suppose they share a predator that eats all of them. Now, as a result, what we might see is that the density of the species is negatively related, because when this species becomes more common, it leads to more predators, because they eat this species, but more predators then eat all the other species, driving their population down. As a result, when this species goes up, these ones go down. The same phenomena you see resulting from competition. Well, what's the poor prey species to do in this situation? Well, they can diversify and use habitats. Assuming the predators only use one habitat, they can, by diversifying, they can avoid sharing predators. This is a phenomenon called apparent competition, or sometimes competition for enemy-free space, and it is a means by which species may be driven to ecologically differentiate, and then presumably they could adapt. So predation, just like interspecific competition, could drive adaptive radiation. Certainly the theory exists to suggest this. However, there are extremely few actual examples of this. Now, you might argue that it's because people haven't been looking, but we have very little evidence that this actually happens. I'd like to point out, of course, that parasitism is pretty much the same as predation in terms of its effects. So parasitism could drive adaptive radiation in this way. And in fact, herbivory is really the same as predation, herbivores predating plants. And so herbivory could also drive adaptive radiation in this way. But again, we have no good examples. Mutualism could also lead to adaptive radiation, and the idea that mutualists, because of the mutualism, may have access to resources they couldn't previously utilize. They may interact with the environment in a different way, and this may prompt adaptive radiation. And mutualism in this way is really the equivalent idea of a key innovation. And certainly, mutualism may have played an important role in adaptive radiation. For example, modern corals being mutualist between algae and certain types of corals, or herbivores and microbial organisms that allow them to ferment plants may have played a role in the diversification of not only mammalian herbivores, but other vertebrates and certainly many insect types. So certainly mutualism may prompt adaptive radiation, although still one might suggest that it is interspecific competition that then drives the diversification after the mutualism has evolved. Coevolutionary relationships might also be important in adaptive radiation. This could happen in many ways. It could be a combination of predation driving a group to use different resources, and then the predators following, and so on. Or it might occur just because there are obligate parasites that when the host speciates and diversifies, the parasites do as well. So coevolution also might play a role. There's been a lot of research recently, a cottage industry of studies in microbial systems basically generating adaptive radiation in a test tube. In fact, one of my favorite paper titles of all time was a paper in Nature this year, The Beagle in a Bottle. This has been very useful in studying evolutionary processes, including adaptive radiation. I'll cut to the chase by saying these studies conclude that competition for resources is far and away the most important factor driving adaptive radiation in these ecosystems. Other processes occasionally, under restricted circumstances, can be important, but interspecific competition far and away seems to be the most important. So I'll just go through these conclusions and in the last minute and a half ask, what about speciation? And the short answer is we don't really understand the role of speciation in adaptive radiation. Sympatric speciation has been often suggested as being important to adaptive radiation. There are a few, and I emphasize a few, examples in which this has been relatively well documented, but for the most part, the suggestions are not well supported, as is sympatric speciation in general. There are some groups that have failed to diversify in the presence of opportunity. The one non-Galapagos Darwin's finch on Cocos Island, if sympatric speciation occurred, why hasn't it irradiated here? There are a number of cases of anolis lizards on islands with great diversity that they haven't radiated. Again, if sympatric speciation occurred, we would expect to see those radiations. So my feeling is sympatric speciation is not usually important in adaptive radiation, but of course others may disagree. Alternatively, non-adaptive speciation may produce the raw material necessary for adaptive radiation. It may simply be that those groups that speciate a lot for non-adaptive reasons then can diverge through character displacement and ecological interactions. And in this way, non-adaptive speciation processes may be important in adaptive radiation, such as sexual selection. Lastly, mentioned by Rick Harrison yesterday and by Doug Fatuma early on, it may be that ecological divergence in allopatry plays the role by initiating the process. That species begin to diverge in allopatry as they adapt to different environments, and ecological adaptation can drive natural selection as an incidental byproduct, and that then produces the ecologically divergent forms that when they come back together then can accentuate their differences and end up with an adaptive radiation. The bottom line on speciation is we don't know. I don't think sympatric speciation is well supported. Ecological divergence in general in allopatry probably plays a role, and non-adaptive speciation processes may also be important. So future directions, more studies on natural selection and speciation. Genomics is going to be particularly important as we can understand the genetic underlying basis of adaptive radiation and how genetics constrains adaptive radiation, and constrains in the Gouldian sense of not only limiting but also directing in along certain lines. We're beginning to see that already, work on sticklebacks, some on Darwin's finches. Certainly this will take off in the years to come as more and more groups have their genome sequenced. Experiments, a very powerful way of studying adaptive radiation. As it's been pointed out, natural selection can quickly drive evolutionary divergence, and that allows us to actually do experiments. Particularly exciting will be the coupling of experimental studies with genomics. And we've just seen the beginning of this in the field with work on sticklebacks out of Dolph Schluter's group. This is going to be incredibly exciting to do experiments and actually look at the genetic basis of adaptive radiation. And finally, I think invasive species can provide quasi-experiments. They set up situations that in many cases test the fundamental aspects of adaptive radiation. They set up experiments that we couldn't ethically do ourselves, but they provide great opportunities. So in summary, it's going to be an exciting time to study adaptive radiation. I think we have a good overall understanding of the basics, but there are still many questions yet to be investigated. And so I think the next few years will prove very interesting. And I'm just going to leave you with pictures of my favorite adaptive radiation. So thanks very much.